Recently, Russia approached North Korea with a request to send troops to the theater of war in Ukraine. This has prompted Europe to a sobering realization of both the scale and far-reaching implications of this conflict. According to a recent Bloomberg publication, Europe now sees clearly where this is all headed. It's also clear that despite Europe's vast resources, the combat readiness of its armed forces remains dismally low. Europe must acknowledge that militarily it is far from prepared, and this state of affairs cannot continue. Today we'll discuss both the reasons behind this negligence and the foreseeable consequences it may bring. Since the end of the Cold War, the West, and Europe in particular, embraced the orthodox belief in perpetual peace. Until Crimea's annexation in 2014, the idea that global terrorism posed the only threat to developed countries wasn't just prevalent, it practically defined all policy. Europe would never start a war within its borders. The European Union, as we know it, was born out of the European coal and steel community. The idea was to bind economic, logistical, and industrial ties between the region's historically contentious powers, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, to prevent the possibility of a new war. An external threat also seemed unlikely. Yes, an autocracy leaning on ideas of historical justice was rising on NATO's and the EU's eastern borders. This autocracy openly labeled the Western world as the enemy. But who really cared about jingoistic propaganda crafted solely for domestic consumption, right? After all, this regime's livelihood largely depended on the money it received in exchange for oil and gas. It's clear that European leaders drew a line between geopolitical posturing and reality. While propagandists painted NATO as an enemy to be repelled, European leaders pointed out that not a single Russian missile could launch without NATO money and technology. Predictably, European armed forces and the military-industrial complex faced chronic underfunding over the next 3 decades. For 30 long years, they shrank, gradually turning into nominal entities without real power. Over this period, NATO morphed into an obscure organization whose summits focused on topics like climate change. But this very trend ultimately shaped today's brave new world. The enormous financial and intellectual resources once spent on preparing for hot war were redirected into the real economy. Former weapon designers and military engineers turned their talents to computer chips, search engines, e-commerce, mobile apps, and video games. Modern life as we know it, the life we carry in our pockets with tools for booking flights, paying taxes, and communicating across continents, owes much to the smart people who shifted from military R&D to high-tech electronics. But in 2022, the Western world, especially Europe, encountered the bitter downside of 3 decades of peace and prosperity: hot war. This was when European governments scrambled to audit their military capacity and were shocked by its insignificance. Potential combat units, including divisions and brigades, existed only on the General Staff's papers. Even though France's armed forces count 250,000 personnel, assembling a combat-ready unit of even a few tens of thousands would be a struggle. To grasp the real state of the ominous NATO, consider that Bloomberg calls Finland's entry into NATO a long-awaited boost to European NATO countries' military capabilities. Finland is 16 times smaller than Germany and 13 times smaller than France. But unlike these two nations, it never abolished conscription and keeps its soldiers well-trained and highly disciplined. This benefits NATO because 20,000 actual soldiers are far better than an armada that exists only on paper. Europe has enjoyed prosperity for the past 3 decades, but this prosperity, understandably, led to the decline and eventual collapse of the continent's military-industrial power. Yet, judging by the current tone of European officials and the media, this negligence is now practically over. It's available for shipping worldwide. So, given the tone of current European officials and media, this era of blissful carelessness is now in the past. Sure, no one is outright saying they intend to confront Putin's army, but we've reached a point where the likelihood of such a scenario no longer seems trivial. Additionally, we see the challenges Europe faces as it awakens from a prolonged slumber. Natural selection has led to a new breed of politicians capable of addressing any problem, except war. Reasonable. These leaders focus on welfare programs, improving living conditions, and increasing life expectancy. Even populist politicians who thrive on resentment and strong enmity mainly advocate for expelling immigrants and strengthening state borders rather than territorial expansion and population growth. These aggressive stances stay within internal borders and are not militarized. The era of European military leaders has ended, as has the reality of new wars, or so it seemed. This circumstance has worked to Putin's advantage. He rules his country during the safest, most prosperous, and peaceful era. The word war quickly becomes obsolete when it comes to first world countries. War is no longer seen as an effective tool for garnering support and consolidating power. Instead, it's something to be avoided at all costs. It's easy to dismiss those who consider negotiation and compromise the only viable solution to any problem, with military response always off the table. But it wasn't just the dominance of peace and the near zero chance of a new war that lulled Europe into its blissful carelessness. It was also the role the United States played in Europe. It's obvious that the US has always been the undisputed leader and champion of NATO. It seemed that the US had taken on the responsibility for Europe's peaceful existence and would intervene as soon as its allies were threatened. They believed that in the unlikely event of armed conflict, they could rely on the world's most powerful military. This belief led them to abandon their own armed forces and direct budgets to address more pressing issues. After all, if anyone dared attack Germany, they would also have to face their transatlantic ally, and it would be madness to take on such an endeavor. But now this blissful reality that European politicians relied on is under attack from two fronts. On one side, they witness a trench war, reminiscent of World War I, claiming tens of thousands of lives right on their doorstep. The architect of this war sees any attempt to negotiate as weakness, shows no sign of slowing, and is ready to draw new belligerents into the conflict. Europe must contend with a force that disregards human life, has no clear objectives, and seeks war for war's sake. On the other side, the US has also changed. Since World War II, every US administration has pledged full support to its allies, regardless of internal shifts. This promise largely reinforced US authority worldwide. People believed that if the US took them under its wing, they were fully secure. This included even tiny states like Latvia, which potentially faced threats from the massive Russian state. But now the US has a force with significant representation in Congress and the potential to capture the Oval Office. This force's political program includes abandoning America's allies. They believe NATO should be dissolved or that the US role in the alliance should be minimized. They argue that there's no valid reason to defend Europe and that countries underfunding their NATO commitments can be left at Putin's mercy. Of course, both Trump and his supporters may be spewing nonsense, but that doesn't improve Europe's position. The US is no longer the rational global force capable of forcing any troublemaker to reconsider. It's no longer a reliable security anchor for national defense. While NATO's Article 5 commitment to collective defense may sound reassuring, no number of hypothetical obligations offers reliable protection, especially when it comes to Donald Trump, who could easily and unpredictably backtrack at the first opportunity. For the first time since World War II, Europe faces a serious security threat, having just realized it cannot fend for itself. It lacks both manpower and firepower, and the meager resources it has are either ineffective or, at best, unreliable. But the bad news for Putin is that such publications suggest Europe is now aware of the issue. They can all foresee possible future developments, and no one is complacent about the prospect of the Russian-Ukrainian theater of war spilling over to other territories, realizing that Europe beginning to increase their defense budgets and modernize their armed forces. Every step Putin takes strengthens Europe's resolve that a major war is very possible. Once you start buying weapons, hiring foreign soldiers, exchanging technology with North Korea, and deploying Kim Jong-un's troops, even the staunchest diplomats begin to consider that an armada of battle tanks might be a useful tool for their diplomacy. The era of perpetual peace is now a thing of the past for everyone, not just for those actively at war. And this is bad news for Putin. His military actions thrive on endless rhetoric and the belief that his moves will face no resistance. He believes that the NATO threat he's warned his people about for 2 decades exists only in his propagandists' imaginations. While Europe realizes that it is ill-prepared for a hot war, that doesn't mean it will cede everything Putin wants to get his hands on. It means that Europe intends to step up its preparations. It has the resources to do so.